In August 2022, the stifling heat of Alabama slowly retreated as night fell over the forest on the edge of Lake Guntersville. Investigator Mark Ellison's flashlight cut a sharp, cold line through the cracked, dry mud, glinting off the tree roots protruding from the ground. "Command Center, I need the forensics team at this location right now. We may have just found something connected to the 1952 case." His voice echoed in the empty expanse, mingling with the wind whistling through the treetops and the faint crackling of the receding lake water. What began as a routine drought survey had just turned into the missing piece that reopened a mystery haunting Alabama for nearly 7 decades. Just a few feet from the lake's edge, beneath a shallow layer of mud, the forensics team uncovered fragments of bone along with a time-worn silver necklace, the very one Coraline Whitlock was last seen wearing the night she and Jonas Kincaid vanished after dinner at the Cullman diner. And for more than half a century, the disappearance of these 2 young people had been a wound Alabama learned to quietly live with. They left the diner in their Ford van, last seen by witnesses near a man in a gray fedora standing silently in the shadows. And then nothing. No trace, no explanation, just an abandoned van, a few strange pieces of evidence, and decades of speculation. The 1952 search lasted weeks but turned up only a wallet, a set of keys, and an empty patch of ground. When the investigation went cold, the file was relegated to storage with a brief note: missing. Circumstances undetermined. The man in the fedora, the only figure from that night, vanished from radar, never seriously questioned. But more than 60 years later, a recovered roll of Kodak film from a lost camera, a strand of DNA on nylon straps, and a multi-generational genealogical journey changed everything. When the DNA was analyzed, everything the Alabama community thought they knew began to crumble. The discovery at Lake Guntersville wasn't just the answer to a disappearance, it was the first domino in a chain of truths buried for nearly 7 decades. Truths about violence, silence, and the shadow of someone no one ever suspected. The Coraline Whitlock and Jonas Kincaid case isn't just a solved mystery. It's proof of the power of modern technology, the voice DNA gives back to the dead, and evidence that justice, no matter how long it takes, even when it feels like it will never come, always finds the person who has to face it. Where are you watching from? Drop your location below. I want to know how far this 70-year-old story has traveled across America. Tonight we're going back to the summer of 1952, tracing Alabama's most haunting disappearance and watching justice once buried under the mud of Lake Guntersville rise into the light. Before we dive into this shocking true story, don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss the next part. The summer night of 1952 settled over the town of Cullman with a thin, damp mist, the yellow glow from old signs spilling onto the patchy asphalt. The diner on Highway 31, where long-haul truckers stopped between legs of their journeys, still smelled of hot coffee and the soft clink of spoons against cups. Coraline Whitlock and Jonas Kincaid stepped out the door, pulling their jackets closed against the evening breeze blowing across the parking lot. They'd just finished a late dinner, saying something quiet to each other too low to drown out the distant hum of the highway. Their Ford van sat under the lot's only streetlight, its glow casting broken patches of light. At the edge of that light, not far from the van, stood the figure of a man leaning against the metal railing. He wore a gray fedora, and though he never moved closer, his presence made the air feel strange. An indescribable sensation, like being watched by someone who didn't want to be seen. Coraline glanced over once and walked faster. Jonas turned his head slightly, his brow creasing just a little before he opened the door. They loaded their bags in the back, exchanged a few quick words like any young couple on a long trip. The Ford van's engine turned over, its low rumble blending with the night insects. They flicked on the headlights, backed out of the spot, and slowly merged into the darkness of the highway where the diner's lights no longer reached. The van drove off, then disappeared completely around a northward curve, leaving nothing but lingering silence. The next morning, Coraline's family waited and waited for her to come home as planned. They called friends, called the places she and Jonas usually stopped, but no one had seen them since the night before. By afternoon, unease turned into real fear when every call went unanswered. By sunset, the family took action. They went to the Cullman police station and reported that the two young people had vanished after leaving the highway diner the previous night. Immediately after the family reported them missing, the Cullman police began retracing everything that happened the last night. Coraline and Jonas were seen. The starting point was the diner on Highway 31. The place they left under flickering yellow light. It was the final confirmed time and location, so every piece of useful information had to begin there. Officers returned to the diner, talking to the waitress, the cook and the long-haul truckers who regularly parked overnight. They needed to pin down exactly how long Coraline and Jonas stayed, where they sat, who they spoke to and whether anything unusual happened while they were there. The waitress that night clearly remembered a polite young couple, tired from a long day, but still chatting happily. No arguments, no signs of tension. The most significant statement, however, came from a trucker parked across the lot. He said he'd seen a man in a fedora standing near the Ford van. Though the diner lights didn't fully illuminate the man's face, he stood there a long time, almost motionless, eyes seemingly fixed on the direction Coraline and Jonas walked. At the time the trucker thought nothing of it, but when he heard about the disappearance, he came forward immediately. Police immediately logged the details about the fedora man. The first hint that someone may have been watching or approaching the victims before they left the diner. Though the information was still vague, it was enough to go into the report and become a key lead for the next step. After finishing witness statements at the diner, police moved to the next phase, verifying Coraline and Jonas's intended route. The pair were believed to be continuing north through Alabama that night, either heading home or to the next town before stopping for the night. Their most likely path was Highway 31, the main artery running through small towns, old gas stations, temporary truck parking areas, and a few roadside motels for long-haul drivers. Police contacted numerous gas stations and late-night stores along the highway. At each stop they asked employees if they'd seen a light-colored Ford van or a young couple pass through that night. A few vaguely recalled an unfamiliar vehicle driving by, but no one could confirm Coraline or Jonas had stopped. This forced police to widen their verification radius. Roadside motels were added to the checklist. Some owners said they no longer remembered the faces of overnight guests from an ordinary day in the 1950s, and nothing indicated Coraline and Jonas had ever checked in. Still, police noted every statement to make sure no possibility was overlooked. Next, police canvassed residents living near the highway. People with stores, farms, or homes right along the road. Most said they saw nothing unusual that night, but a few remembered hearing vehicles fairly late, breaking the usual quiet. Though nothing could yet be concluded, police collected the data to compare against the time Coraline and Jonas left the diner. A separate team spoke directly with long-haul truckers resting in Cullman and nearby town. Truckers tend to stay alert, observe well, and often remember license plates and vehicles they see on the road. Several confirmed seeing the Ford van heading north on the highway. One said he thought another vehicle was following fairly close behind the van, but he wasn't sure because oncoming headlights made it hard to see clearly. That detail caught police attention. Was that vehicle connected to the man in the fedora? The statements varied in reliability, but together they helped reconstruct the overall picture of Coraline and Jonas's journey before they vanished. More importantly, this was the first time police recorded that a strange man may have appeared at exactly the right time and place, possibly watching the couple. By the end of the day, the investigation file had its first entries about the route, preliminary timeline and witnesses. Though there was still no hard evidence of foul play, the investigators' instincts were starting to lean that way. But they had nothing concrete yet, because no physical evidence or direct traces had been found along the path Coraline and Jonas likely took. The first details were now on record: a man in a fedora, a Ford van leaving a diner at night, and a northward journey with no known stops. Everything paused there, before the official field search began. The data gathered from initial witness statements made police realize they couldn't just stay at the station compiling information. They had to get out and comb every mile of road Coraline and Jonas might have traveled. Right after wrapping up interviews in Cullman, a search force was formed and split into smaller teams to conduct field sweeps along Highway. This was the natural shift from verifying statements to checking real terrain, where even the smallest trace could answer the biggest question: where did Coraline and Jonas go the night they disappeared? The search teams were divided into three main segments: Cullman, Huntsville, and Decatur, Huntsville. Each segment was broken down further to ensure nothing was missed. The first team covered the area just outside Cullman, checking places vehicles often stopped, empty lots, farm turnoffs, and temporary trucker parking areas. The second team swept near Huntsville, where long stretches had no streetlights, perfect for an unusual nighttime stop. The third team moved up to Decatur and continued to Huntsville, covering desolate sections mixed with sparse woods and abandoned buildings. On the Cullman-Huntsville stretch, officers stopped at small cabins tucked deep in the woods. Some had been empty for years, doors cracked, roofs rotted, but they were still considered potential spots for a perpetrator to pause or hide evidence. Each cabin was opened and searched, wood floors, walls and the areas behind them carefully examined by flashlight for signs of movement, strange objects, or footprints. None showed clear signs of Coraline and Jonas, yet police still marked every location for possible second checks once more data came in. Farther out, near the sparse woods, several officers spotted old tire tracks in the dirt. Some were clearly from trucks, but others matched the type of vehicle like a Ford van. Those spots were circled on the map because even if they couldn't be sure they belonged to Coraline and Jonas, they fell within the relevant time window of the disappearance night. These were places police planned to examine more closely once cross-referenced with other teams' findings. Near Decatur, several empty roadside lots drew attention. These areas were often used by drivers to rest or check minor vehicle issues. Police carefully inspected flattened grass, footprints, or any small item that might have been dropped. At one spot the team noted an area of disturbed soil, but couldn't tell if it was human or animal activity, so they simply marked it for a second look when more information was available. The stretch toward Huntsville was considered the widest and most complex. This area had many small turnoffs leading into woods or to abandoned structures, prime locations for an unexpected stop or sudden change of direction. Officers carefully checked each entrance, shining lights under roadside brush for signs of dragging, paper, cloth, or small belongings. Still, at this stage no evidence directly tied to Coraline or Jonas appeared. Even so, police logged numerous suspicious spots to revisit, following the standard two-pass protocol to leave no stone unturned. What worried the search teams most was the absolute silence of the highway at night. Long stretches with no homes, no lights, just woods on both sides made finding traces extremely difficult. Still, police valued this progress, because searching the terrain helped identify places the young couple might have been forced to stop accidentally or otherwise. By the end of the day, the master investigation map was covered in red, green, and yellow dots, marking every place they had searched and every location still inconclusive. Though the first day yielded no concrete traces, the field search had built the initial skeleton of the entire investigation process. From here they would return to questionable spots, and combine them with whatever would be discovered in the days ahead when the search suddenly shifted direction, thanks to a find on the road to Decatur. While search teams were still combing the roads between Decatur and Huntsville, a sudden report instantly shifted the entire investigation. A long-haul trucker running the Birmingham to Nashville route stopped at the Decatur police station and said he had spotted something lying right at the edge of the grass along Highway 31. Less than a few miles from where a search team had just passed. When he gave the initial description, a small light-colored wallet and a set of keys with a stainless steel keyring, the officers knew they couldn't waste a single minute. When they reached the scene, police immediately realized these were not random lost items. The wallet was lying off to the side on the ground, not heavily covered in dirt, a sign it hadn't been there long. The keyring was about half a meter away from the wallet, as if it had been tossed in the direction of the wind rather than naturally falling from a pocket or purse. A light breeze had only bent the surrounding grass. It wasn't strong enough to move something as heavy as a set of keys. That made the placement of the items even more suspicious. What was inside the wallet made the officers freeze. A library card, a few small photographs, and a handwritten note. Everything bearing the name Coraline Whitlock. No cash, no official ID, but every item inside was clean, not torn or crumpled. That led police to lean away from the idea that the wallet had fallen out during a struggle. It looked more like it had been deliberately removed from a pocket and left here on purpose. Police quickly marked off the scene and cordoned off a wide enough radius to check for footprints and tire tracks. Even though there was no obvious mud, the ground showed patches of grass pressed flat in a long dragged pattern, indicating someone had moved through the area recently. One officer crouched down and studied a cluster of low grass that had been crushed flat. In the slanting afternoon sunlight, it stood out sharply from the rest. It wasn't conclusive, but it suggested someone had walked very close to where the wallet lay, maybe even the person who placed it there. What grabbed investigators' attention most was the location itself. It was close to the stretchish road a search team had already covered, yet tucked in a spot they could easily have missed while focusing on major pull-offs or roadside cabins. If that trucker hadn't had sharp eyes, this crucial evidence might have stayed overlooked. Back at the station, as the information came together, the urgency reached a new level. Finding the wallet completely changed the nature of the case. From a missing persons mystery with no clear cause, it had turned into something that now carried obvious signs of criminal activity. The fact that the wallet and keys were found separated, and right on the route from Cullman to Decatur, suggested someone had deliberately ditched or tossed them from a moving vehicle, and apparently wanted them to be found. Among the early theories, two stood out. First, the wallet and keys could have been a distress signal Coraline dropped while fighting back or trying to escape danger, but the items were too neatly separated, and the scene showed no clear signs of a struggle, so that theory didn't hold up well. Second, and far more plausible from an investigative standpoint, the perpetrator had intentionally thrown the wallet and keys here to mislead police, or simply to get rid of unnecessary items after going through them. The fact that photos, the note and other personal items, were still inside convinced investigators the motive wasn't robbery. Whatever drove this person, it wasn't theft. Another key detail, the location was a good distance from Cullman, yet still directly on the route Coraline and Jonas were supposed to take. That reinforced the suspicion that they never left their planned path. They may have been intercepted or forced to stop somewhere nearby. After the wallet was bagged and logged into evidence, police went back to the route map and marked the scene in red ink. This was the first solid lead strong enough to raise the case's alert level. The official file description was updated, missing persons with indications of criminal activity. With this new clue, the search along the entire route had to shift into a higher gear, because the next and most critical question was, if the wallet and keys ended up here, where did the young couple's vehicle go? And what happened between this spot and the next point on the road? Finding Coraline's wallet and keys in Decatur prompted investigators to immediately extend the search northward, and during that sweep another report from Huntsville police changed everything. A local railroad worker reported an unfamiliar vehicle, abandoned near the old depot, a quiet, rarely visited area wedged between derelict warehouses and disused tracks. When the team arrived, they quickly confirmed it was Coraline and Jonas's Ford. The van sat alone beside a stained concrete wall, its tires coated in a thin layer of dust that suggested it had been there for several hours, but not much longer. The driver's door and sliding side door showed no signs of forced entry, meaning the vehicle had been parked deliberately with a key, not abandoned after a fight. Inside, however, told a very different story. The moment the doors opened, officers noticed the driver's seat had been shoved far back, as if someone had yanked or pushed it with force. The seat cushion bore a deep indentation, evidence of a heavy impact or sudden adjustment in a hurry. The floor was scattered with small scuff marks, not blood but enough to raise questions about someone trying to shake something off the van's interior. The most suspicious discovery was on the rear floor, a coil of nylon binding straps, the kind commonly used in 1950s industrial shipping, lying neatly underneath. There was no reason for such straps to be in a young couple's van on a simple interstate trip. Next to them in the front glove box was an old pair of yellow rubber gloves dusted with gray residue. Those gloves didn't match anything Coraline or Jonas would normally carry. In the front compartment, police also found a small box of .38 special ammunition tossed carelessly into the glove box, as if someone had flung it there without a second thought. Whether or not the rounds were connected to a weapon wasn't yet clear, but their presence in the van confirmed one thing to investigators: this vehicle had been under someone else's control, not Coraline and Jonas. Officers immediately checked whether any of the victims' personal belongings were missing. Some clothing bags and small items remained, but Coraline's ever-present Kodak camera was gone. The missing camera not only suggested theft by the perpetrator, but also raised the possibility that the roll of film inside contained images or information the perpetrator didn't want anyone to see. Most importantly, there was no blood, no drag marks, and no torn items anywhere in the van, meaning the van itself was not the primary crime scene. All the disturbance inside appeared to have happened after the vehicle was parked here. That made the van a secondary scene, where the perpetrator ditched the vehicle, not where the crime took place. Police searched the surrounding depot area for footprints, drag marks, or dropped items. The dry ground and sparse grass held no clear traces. The nearby abandoned buildings were checked too, but aside from some swept-away dust and old handprints on walls, nothing proved the perpetrator had lingered. The one thing police could confirm was the distance between where the wallet was found in Decatur and the van's location in Huntsville showed the perpetrator had deliberately continued driving after separating Coraline and Jonas from their vehicle. The fact that the van was left neatly parked, doors locked normally, and in an out-of-the-way spot suggested the perpetrator had some familiarity with the Huntsville area or had passed through before. Taken together, the nylon straps, rubber gloves, box of ammunition, shoved seat and missing camera, investigators understood the case had grown far beyond what they first imagined. This was no longer a simple disappearance. It was clear evidence of a calculated, prepared, and intentional crime. Discovering the van in Huntsville didn't just open a new investigative direction, it launched a chain of bigger questions. Where were the two young people taken after leaving the van? Who was behind the wheel in those final hours? And what happened on the stretch of road from Decatur to this remote spot? From the vehicle abandoned among the old depot buildings, the case moved into an entirely different, far more complex and frightening layer of investigation than the officers had ever anticipated. Once the abandoned van in Huntsville was confirmed, police returned to Cullman to re-examine every detail from before Coraline and Jonas left the diner. The fact that the vehicle was found so far away meant the perpetrator had both time and means to move freely, making everything that happened in Cullman, especially around the parking lot, more critical than ever. The first witness who had mentioned a man in a fedora was brought back in for a more detailed statement. He was a long-haul trucker who had parked across from the diner that night. When questioned further, he described the man standing near the Ford van as tall, thin, broad-shouldered, walking slowly, but with obvious purpose. He couldn't make out the face clearly because of the poor light and distance, but the overall impression was unmistakable, unusually tall for the area, standing motionless for too long, and the gray fedora making him stand out among the few vehicles in the lot. The witness remembered that the man never went inside the diner. He just stayed at the edge of the light near Coraline and Jonas's van, facing the diner door as if waiting for someone to come out. When Coraline and Jonas appeared at the entrance, the man in the fedora tilted his head slightly toward them and held that observing posture for a long time. There was no direct approach, no unusual gestures, but his focus on the young couple was something the witness couldn't forget. A diner employee was also re-interviewed, and though unsure, vaguely recalled a man wearing an old-style hat standing outside the window while she was cleaning tables. She never saw his face, but the general build matched the trucker's description, reinforcing that this person was indeed present at the exact time. Based on the new statements, police asked the technical unit to create a composite sketch, in 1952 far from perfect, but still a vital tool. The witness was guided through every detail: height, build, shoulder width, the shape of the hat, the watching posture. The initial sketch showed a man roughly 30-40 years old, taller than average, with a long face, and the fedora shading his forehead. Though the composite couldn't capture everything, it was the first visual of the mysterious man who appeared right when Coraline and Jonas walked out of the diner. When asked about the man's behavior, the witness insisted he didn't act like someone waiting for a friend. No nervous gestures, no searching look for a familiar face. Instead, he stood perfectly still like an observer, purposeful, calculated but trying not to draw attention. Even while recounting it, the witness said his feeling at the time was this guy wasn't here by accident. Another detail police zeroed in on: the fedora looked fairly new and different from the caps local workers usually wore. That suggested the stranger might not be from Cullman, or at least not someone who regularly came through the area. In a small town like Cullman, a distinctive outsider tended to stick in people's memory. Once the composite was finished, police posted the drawing at the station and shared it with field teams. They hoped someone along the route, or at roadside stops, might recognize him. Although there was still no direct evidence tying him to the disappearance, his presence at the exact time and place Coraline and Jonas left made it impossible to ignore. The Cullman witness statements created a major milestone. For the first time, The case file contained a figure who could be directly linked to the moment of disappearance, someone neither police nor the community had ever seen before. And from the moment that composite went up, the hunt to identify the man in the fedora opened an entirely new investigative path. The information obtained from the witness statements about the man in the fedora made the atmosphere in the command room even heavier, because every new piece was now pointing to the fact that this case had never been an ordinary missing persons situation from the very start. From that point on, the investigation team was forced to go back and re-examine every step taken during the first week, and the truth that emerged from report after report made everyone realize just how many critical things they had missed. National Highway 31, the route where Coraline and Jonas were confirmed to have left Cullman, could have been the key that revealed the direction taken by whoever interfered with the young couple's trip. Yet no checkpoints were set up on that road and no vehicles were monitored during the hours when every minute counted. No license plates were recorded, no one was stopped for verification, and no effort was made to identify any unfamiliar vehicle traveling behind the Ford van. The opportunities to detect the suspect's next movements, opportunities that may have existed on that very first night, slipped away in silence. The handling of the abandoned van in Huntsville remained a deep wrinkle in the investigation. The vehicle was both the most important piece of evidence and a secondary crime scene containing numerous signs of tampering. Yet the first response team opened the doors and searched the interior without following full preservation protocol. Potential fingerprints were touched. The inside of the doors and dashboard were handled repeatedly, smearing any faint prints that might have belonged to the stranger. Even though fingerprint technology at the time was not highly advanced, proper collection could still have distinguished the victim's prints from an outsider's, a crucial piece of data that was now ruined. It wasn't just the van itself. The area around the old depot where the van was abandoned was not thoroughly searched immediately upon discovery. The derelict warehouses nearby, places that could have contained traces such as fabric fibers, footprints, tire marks, or even dropped items, were only superficially examined during the initial approach. A proper search did not take place until many days later, by which time weather and the passage of time had erased almost any chance of recovering useful evidence. The long gap between discovering the van and conducting a detailed sweep left virtually zero possibility of obtaining physical clues. The scattered homes and small stores around the depot were also not canvassed in a timely manner. People who lived and worked nearby might have seen a stranger walking away from the area or calling for a ride, information their memories would have retained clearly that first morning. But many days passed before police returned to ask questions, and by then all they received were vague answers. Someone who had been certain "I saw somebody walk past" now only said "maybe I'm remembering wrong," and vital details faded beyond recovery. As the entire sequence of events was reviewed again, both veteran and newer investigators reached the same conclusion. If those first steps had been taken more carefully, the case could have gone in a completely different direction. At that moment the pieces were still very close together. The highway wasn't heavily traveled, the van hadn't yet been altered by time, the scene was still fresh, and witnesses still remembered clearly. Everything was within reach. But because of delays and an initial underestimation of the gravity of the situation, those critical signals were pushed out of reach. A mixture of frustration and helplessness spread through the team every time the reports were rewritten. No one dared say it out loud, but everyone understood that the case had gone off the rails in the very first week, and from then on they were forced to follow an increasingly dark and winding trail. Still, those mistakes also forced them to change their approach in the subsequent phases, more cautious, more thorough, and never overlooking even the smallest detail, because they could not allow Coraline and Jonas's case to sink into silence one more time. The mistakes made in the first week of the investigation left such a large void that even though the police continued searching for many months afterward, the case of Coraline and Jonas gradually ground to a halt. No new leads, no additional physical evidence, no other witnesses came forward. Every avenue of investigation looped back to the starting point, and the most frightening part was that the longer it dragged on, the more the remaining traces of that night of disappearance faded away. In the end, the case was moved to the status no officer ever wants, indefinite inactive file. In the years that followed, the towns of Cullman, Decatur, and Huntsville would still occasionally mention the names Coraline Whitlock and Jonas Kincaid, the young people who vanished in the middle of a trip without anyone knowing what they had gone through. Every year brought a few scattered tips, Someone thought they had seen a man resembling Jonas in Tennessee. Another person claimed to have heard about the van turning up near the state line. An elderly woman vaguely recalled seeing a figure running past a forest cabin. But every lead was either unverified, unrelated, or reached the police too late to be useful. Almost every tip ended the same way: vague, fragmented, and insufficient to produce any real progress. The evidence locker at the police department gradually became the only place still holding fragments of the story. The wallet, the key ring, the old photographs, the nylon cord, the rubber gloves, the half-empty box of ammunition, the composite sketch of the man in the fedora. All of it was stored in faded brown evidence boxes sealed with old tape. As the years passed, each time the files were inventoried, those items were moved from one shelf to another and eventually placed lower and lower on the priority list. At a certain point, even brand new officers only knew the case from what their seniors told them: an old missing persons case with nothing left to chase. At the same time, the witnesses who had appeared in the early phase gradually disappeared. Some died of old age, some moved to other states, and many were left with only broken fragments of memory, hazy images no longer usable for official records. The truck driver who had described the man in the fedora had also aged quickly. His memory was now spotty and no longer clear enough to help reconstruct details. What had once been promising leads had become nothing more than faint shadows of the past. Police attempted to reopen the case several times in the 1960s, 1970s, and 1980s. But each time they had to close it again due to lack of information. Forensic science of that era was unable to analyze trace evidence at the microscopic level, much less recover or extract DNA from decades-old items. Reports from every period contained the same repeated line: no progress. When the 1990s arrived and modern forensic technologies began to emerge, the Coraline and Jonas case still was not prioritized. There were too many backlogged files, and new cases always demanded more resources. The 1952 disappearance slowly became part of the town's collective memory. A sad story retold at family gatherings, in small coffee shops, or on old anniversary dates. But the justice system, it was nothing more than a thin, dusty folder. Only at the beginning of the 2000s did everything change. The state of Alabama launched a statewide program to review every cold case, searching for files that could potentially be solved with new technology. Investigators were required to re-examine each case, reassess every piece of evidence, and note whether any traces were suitable for modern testing. During that review, the names Coraline and Jonas reappeared, for the first time in almost half a century. The Archives Department noticed that the evidence in this case was in significantly better condition than many others from the same era. The nylon binding straps, gloves, ammunition box, and personal belongings were all still in good enough shape to be re-examined with new methods. Even more importantly, the file recorded that Coraline had been carrying a Kodak camera that was never recovered, a detail that modern photographic and digital analysis could turn into a breakthrough if the camera ever surfaced. The final notes in the 2002 review report were brief. Case has potential for reinvestigation. Recommend transfer to active cold case unit. And from that moment, after 50 years of oblivion, the file of Coraline Whitlock and Jonas Kincaid was officially reopened, ready for an entirely new journey of decoding. But this time with an advantage previous generations never had. Science and technology had advanced to the point where travel routes, speeds, and possible paths could be reconstructed using geographic data. The crude physical evidence from 1952, once thought worthless, could now become the first pieces in recreating that night. The cold case team's very first task was to rebuild the timeline, no longer relying on witness memory but on scientific modeling. The investigators worked with Geographic Information System (GIS) experts to digitize the entire Cullman-Decatur-Huntsville route as it existed in 1952. Old paper maps were gathered from libraries, Department of Transportation archives, and historical survey. Every stretch of road, every turnoff, every small bridge, and every scattered settlement was entered into the GIS to create the most accurate geographic model possible of the time of the crime. The technology allowed them to simulate roads that still existed unchanged, roads that had been altered over time, and areas that had once been sparse forest or empty land, but had since disappeared. In parallel with map digitization, the team built a 3D model showing the possible movement of the Ford van along the entire route. Using terrain data, average speeds for that type of vehicle in that era, and logical stopping points, A travel simulation was created that let investigators see at a glance what Coraline and Jonas might have experienced. The model also allowed them to run scenarios. If the perpetrator blocked the vehicle at point A, which direction would he most likely turn? If he wanted to avoid populated areas, which route was most feasible? And if he wanted to abandon the vehicle in Huntsville without being noticed, which escape route would he choose? While running the simulations, one detail stood out. If the perpetrator wanted to leave the Decatur area quickly after disposing of Coraline's wallet and keys, the most advantageous direction was not deeper into Huntsville, but northeast toward Tennessee. Yet the van was abandoned in Huntsville, suggesting a significant possibility. The vehicle was not left at the point where the perpetrator separated from the victims, but at a location he deliberately chose to mislead investigators. The GIS experts continued filtering secondary roads connecting Huntsville to the Tennessee border. They built the most probable route based on 3 criteria: fewest homes, fewest intersections, and the most forested or empty land. Places where the perpetrator could stop unnoticed. Surprisingly, the route that best matched lay roughly 30+ miles from where the wallet was found, near a series of old logging trails used for freight trucks in the 1950s. Reconstructing the timeline did not just reveal direction of travel, it also clarified behavioral shifts in direction. By comparing realistic speeds and travel times between points, the model showed that the perpetrator likely transferred Coraline and Jonas to a different vehicle shortly after leaving Decatur. He then continued driving the Ford van north, looped into Huntsville, and abandoned it at the old depot. The probable purpose was to confuse the investigation and make police believe the victims were still in the van when it reached Huntsville. This discovery had a powerful impact on the entire case. Once the timeline proved the van did not reflect the actual journey, every clue pointing to Huntsville became part of a deception. The perpetrator had most likely taken the victims out of Alabama very early and chosen Tennessee as the next direction of travel, a scenario that matched the reality that many 1950s cases involved moving victims across state lines, where jurisdictional gaps made prosecution difficult. After the timeline model was complete, the cold case team began narrowing the suspect pool using geographic factors. Individuals who lived, worked, or regularly traveled between Alabama and Tennessee in 1952 were placed on a review list. Long-haul truck drivers, freight workers, mechanics, and anyone whose job required frequent interstate travel became the primary focus, because they knew the roads, could handle vehicles quickly, and knew how to avoid detection. From the maps, the 3D models, and the route analysis, a new picture of the night of the disappearance finally took shape. The journey did not end where the van was found, but continued in an entirely different direction beyond Alabama's borders. With this foundation, the case moved into a deeper phase of investigation, where modern techniques would continue to uncover clues that no one half a century earlier could have seen. The geographic analyses and 3D modeling had produced major breakthroughs, but the thing that completely changed the direction of the investigation came from a seemingly unrelated source: a batch of old items donated to a charity center in Huntsville. While sorting through the objects, an employee happened to find a small metal box containing a scratched and dusty old Kodak Retina camera, yet still retaining the distinctive shape of 1950s models. What caught his attention was the faint engraved initials on the bottom. The information was immediately forwarded to the police department. Within hours, the cold case team confirmed that this was Coraline's Kodak camera, the piece of evidence that had vanished from the Ford van in 1952, and was considered the most important indication that someone had deliberately removed it. The camera was taken to the lab, where experts began examining every detail. Although the metal body was slightly dented, the internal film advance mechanism still worked, and most importantly, inside was an undeveloped roll of film. No one on the team said it out loud, but everyone felt the weight of the moment. A roll of film from 1952, if it could still be recovered, could be a direct bridge back to the final hours before Coraline and Jonas disappeared. The imaging specialists began the recovery process. The film had aged. The outer gelatin layer showed mold spots and cracks from time. Every step had to be done in a dark room with strictly controlled temperature and humidity. They used chemical revival methods designed for vintage film, mixing special solutions to minimize the risk of tearing or emulsion peeling. As the first frames began to appear, the entire team practically held their breath. Frame 1, Coraline and Jonas standing next to the Ford van, taken in the Cullman parking lot. Coraline is beaming under the yellow lights of the diner, while Jonas raises his hand to shield his eyes from the sun even though it was already evening. This was the last photo showing them safe and happy. Frame 2, the interior of the van, probably taken by Jonas after they had packed up. Everything is still neat: handbags, jackets, food box. The driver's seat has not yet been pushed out of place the way police later found it. Frame 3, a rather blurry shot of the parking lot, taken at an angle toward the edge of the light. The film surface was heavily modeled with mold, but the technicians increased contrast and rebuilt the image structure to make the details clearer. In the lower left corner, part of a metal railing can be seen, matching the witness description. In the distance, in the shadowed area, there is the figure of a man wearing a fedora, standing with his back to the camera, shoulders slightly tilted as if watching the diner. The photo is not sharp enough to see a face, but the outline of the hat, the height relative to the railing, and the posture all match perfectly with the statements of the long-haul trucker and the diner employee. This image not only confirmed the presence of the fedora man at the scene, it also strongly supported one major theory: the perpetrator approached Coraline and Jonas right there in the parking lot, before the van ever left Cullman. The fact that the roll stopped here left the question of any subsequent frames forever unanswered. The camera may have been seized immediately afterward. Coraline may have intended to take more pictures but never got the chance. Or the perpetrator may have taken the camera because he realized he had been captured in the shot. Investigators could not determine who donated the batch of old items, since donation bins are usually collected from multiple sources. However, the sudden reappearance of Coraline's camera after half a century was no coincidence. The cold case team listed 3 possibilities: the perpetrator's family kept it, and a later generation unknowingly donated it. The person holding the camera became frightened and quietly got rid of it when the cold case program was relaunched. An indirectly related individual had kept the camera but never knew it was connected to the case. Whichever scenario was true, the camera's appearance at the exact moment the file was reopened convinced everyone they were on the right track. From the recovered images, the team reconstructed a new timeline for that night. Coraline and Jonas left the diner in completely normal spirits. The fedora man was watching them right there in the parking lot. He may have followed them closely or approached the moment they got into the van. The Kodak camera, once just a vague detail among the missing evidence, had now become the first photographic proof, confirming the presence and position of the suspect. This discovery pushed the case into a new phase, where the perpetrator was no longer a vague shadow from 1952, but a real figure that could be traced, compared, and identified using modern techniques. The restored photographs from Coraline's Kodak had turned the fedora man from a vague silhouette into a traceable subject. However, to take the next step and physically link him to the evidence, the cold case team needed something undeniable, something that could survive 50 years of blurred memory and time. And they found it in the least expected place: the coil of nylon binding straps recovered from the Ford van in 1952. For decades these nylon cords had simply been regarded as odd items, whose true purpose no one could determine. But with modern forensics, nylon, a synthetic, non-porous material, turned out to be an excellent surface for retaining microscopic biological traces invisible to the naked eye. The cold case team sent samples to a lab specializing in historical evidence. The experts used touch DNA techniques, capable of isolating just a few skin cells left on objects decades old. Although nylon is a difficult surface for DNA adhesion, the combination of good storage conditions, a dry environment, and the fact that the coiled straps had lain undisturbed for over half a century made recovery feasible. The extraction process was carried out with absolute precision. Surface dust was removed using controlled ion solution. Each segment of nylon was sampled using a micro-wet vacuum method. The collected cells were amplified to produce enough material for analysis. When the results came back, the team held its breath. The DNA found belonged to a male. This was the first discovery directly tied to evidence that neither Coraline nor Jonas had brought with them. The technicians quickly entered the DNA into CODIS and every Alabama state database available. The result was a single short line: no match. The male who left DNA on the nylon straps had no prior criminal record, or he had committed crimes before DNA databases existed. Either way, the lack of a match opened an entirely new investigative path. Forensic genealogy, the field that had already solved dozens of similar cold cases. The DNA sample was sent to a leading genealogy team, where they used genetic data to search for distant relatives of the person who left it. The process is complex. The DNA is broken into SNP segments, then compared against millions of user profiles in public databases. Instead of looking for the suspect directly, they look for people with similar genetic markers, distant cousins, descendants of siblings, or even third great-grandchildren. When the preliminary analysis was complete, the experts reported one critical piece of information. The DNA sample was connected to a cluster of relatives belonging to two large family lines living along the Alabama-Tennessee border, exactly the direction the GIS model had previously predicted. This got the team's full attention, because it reinforced the idea that the perpetrator may have fled north from Alabama that night. The genetic lineage suggested the DNA most likely belonged to a man living in rural southern Tennessee during the 1950s, an area with many back roads the perpetrator could have used to travel undetected. But genealogy did not just point to a region. The experts began building multi-generational family trees, connecting branches to identify the most likely individuals, males aged 25-40 in 1952, living or working near the state line, and especially those who traveled frequently. Every name was added to the suspect list, but the team still lacked enough data to narrow it further. The important thing was this: the DNA from the nylon straps had led them to a real family cluster, a community in the right geographic location, at the exact time of the disappearance. That meant the perpetrator was no longer an anonymous figure in the dark. He was now within a definable range, a family branch that could be traced to its end. And from the trace DNA still clinging to the dusty nylon coil inside the van, the door to tracking the killer had opened, not through witness memory, but through biological evidence that never lied. Extracting DNA from the nylon straps, and concluding that the genetic profile belonged to a family branch along the Alabama-Tennessee border, created an entirely new foundation for the investigation. The genealogy experts began building a family tree from that DNA data, and the process revealed a journey far more complex than any detective could have imagined. A network stretching across thousands of branches and more than 2 centuries. The tree was constructed by matching DNA segments to hundreds of users in public databases. Each person contributes only a fragment of genetic information, but when combined, they form a shared map of ancestry, often reaching back to the 18th. The experts had to work backward from early couples, separate the branches by descendants, eliminate female lines that did not match, and focus on the male lines, carrying the structure directly related to the DNA found on the nylon straps. The family tree gradually expanded farther into northern Tennessee, then dipped into the agricultural South, where families had migrated along the Tennessee River generations earlier. After weeks of narrowing, the experts discovered that the closest DNA matches all converged on one family group living in Lincoln County, Tennessee, an area less than an hour's drive from Huntsville. That is where a name began repeating: Mercer. The Mercer line had deep roots in the region, with generations working as farmers, mechanics, truckers and railroad workers, occupations that regularly required travel between Tennessee and Alabama. Each job fit the profile of someone who could operate various vehicles, knew the back roads well, and could cross state lines without drawing attention. When the tree was extended to generations born between 1910 and 1930, the age range that would fit the suspected perpetrator in 1952, about 24 Mercer men remained. The cold case team, working with the genealogy experts, began vetting each one using 3 key criteria: 1, age in 1952, occupation, 3, exact place of residence at the time of the crime. Names were crossed off one by one when information did not match. Some were too young, others were overseas in the military throughout 1952. Still others had medical records proving they could not travel far. The Mercer branch remained fairly broad, but only a handful of names still qualified for serious consideration. To narrow it further, investigators compared the Mercer family members' known addresses with the GIS model reconstructing the perpetrator's likely route. Astonishing overlaps began to appear. A small group of Mercer men lived right beside the backroads the model indicated the perpetrator most likely used on the night of the disappearance. Some even lived near the routes connecting Decatur to Huntsville, or from the Alabama border into Tennessee. From this short list, the investigators took another step, Checking occupations. The fedora man in Coraline's photo was tall, broad-shouldered and had a watchful stance. Based on witness descriptions and behavioral analysis, the perpetrator was likely someone accustomed to manual labor, capable of using significant force when needed, and experienced enough to move victims while leaving minimal traces. At this point, only 3 Mercer names still fit. The cold case team requested additional records from Tennessee and Alabama state archives, tax files, vehicle registrations, factory worker cards, even job applications and payroll ledgers. These documents helped add one more critical filter: which of these Mercer men were actually in Alabama during the summer of 19. When all the data was laid out together, one name stood out above the rest, not because of a prior record, but because this individual's file matched virtually every parameter of the reconstructed timeline. Hollis Mercer. Born in 1921, Hollis was 31 years old in 1952, exactly the age witnesses estimated. He had worked as an industrial machine repairman at a shop near Fayetteville, Tennessee, but the job required him to travel between Tennessee and Huntsville for maintenance contracts at factory. Old records even showed he had been in Huntsville during the month of the disappearance, a detail that lined up almost perfectly with the Ford van's route. Most importantly, the physical description in his old military service file listed Hollis as taller than average, lean but strong, with a long face, features that matched the composite of the fedora man described by witnesses. When the name Hollis Mercer appeared in the genealogy team's final report, the entire investigative team knew they had moved past the phase of aimless searching. The DNA from the nylon straps was no longer an isolated piece of data. It had led them to a real person who lived at a real time in the exact area the perpetrator could have passed through. And from that point the case entered its most critical stage, verifying whether Hollis Mercer was the man who stood in the darkness behind the Ford van on the night Coraline and Jonas vanished. The name Hollis Mercer stood out from the family tree not just because the DNA matched the lineage, but because the traces of his life lined up in an almost uncanny way with every link in the case. When the cold case unit began digging into employment records and travel history, Mercer's portrait sharpened fast. He was no longer a vague possibility but the highest probability suspect the investigation had touched in 50 years. Mercer had worked as a long-haul truck driver, hauling machinery parts between Tennessee, Huntsville and the industrial pockets of Alabama. Night runs were routine for him, which meant he regularly traveled the back roads, exactly the kind of routes the killer could have used to stay off the radar while moving Coraline and Jonas. Old employment files showed he frequented the industrial area north of Huntsville, just a few miles from the depot where the Ford van was abandoned. That proximity gave the investigators chills. Mercer didn't just pass through the area, he knew the terrain, knew the shortcuts, knew which stretches were deserted after dark. Knowledge that matched perfectly the complicated route the GIS model had reconstructed. His military service file from his younger days made the suspicion even sharper. The records listed him at roughly 6 feet tall, lean but wiry, almost identical to the composite built from witness description. Long face, slightly high cheekbones, pointed chin, all notable matches to what witnesses remembered seeing under dim light. But the detail that made everyone stop cold was Mercer's habit of wearing a fedora. A faded family photo from the Mercer clan in the late 1940s showed him in a crowd, wearing the exact style and color of gray fedora as the shadowy figure in the last frame of the Kodak film roll. To the investigators this was no longer coincidence. That image forced them to confront the likelihood that Mercer was the man standing in the shadows of the Cullman parking lot in More data piled on in the summer of 1952. The exact season Coraline and Jonas vanished. Mercer was logged working the supply route between Fayetteville, Huntsville and Decatur. Those locations lined up perfectly with the Ford van's movements on the night they disappeared. Even an old job application from that year had Mercer writing in his own hand that he frequently stayed overnight in Alabama on long runs, opening the door to the possibility that he was in Cullman or Decatur the very night they went missing. Even though no clear record placed him there, investigators started looking harder at Mercer's life after night. He married, separated, moved repeatedly between Tennessee and Alabama. No major criminal record, but neighbors described him as quiet, hard to read and gone for days at a time because of work. The picture that emerged was of a solitary man, private enough to hide whatever he didn't want noticed. Yet for all the pieces pointing in one direction, the investigation still hit the same wall. There was no direct forensic evidence tying Mercer to the night. The DNA on the nylon straps only proved the killer belonged to the Mercer line. It couldn't say it was Hollis Mercer himself. The Kodak film showed a fedora-wearing figure, but no face. Witnesses described a man's build but couldn't identify him. Travel patterns fit Mercer, but they could have fit a handful of other people in the region at the time. So to name Hollis Mercer as the actual perpetrator, the team needed one final step, the only thing that could tie him absolutely to the 1952 evidence. They had to obtain a direct DNA sample from Mercer himself, or from a male descendant carrying his Y-line. That was no simple task. Mercer had been dead for years, and most of his family was scattered across Tennessee. But if they could locate a son, grandson, or any male heir carrying Mercer's Y DNA, a comparison sample would give the final answer. The case now stood on the most critical threshold it had faced in half a century. Either Hollis Mercer would be cleared as a suspect, or the entire story of Coraline and Jonas's disappearance was about to be solved after 50 years in the dark. Everything hinged on finding living DNA carrying the Mercer blood, the last piece that could unlock the truth. Getting direct DNA to confirm Hollis Mercer as the suspect was no longer optional. It was the only way to push the investigation into its decisive phase. Mercer had been dead for years, so the only remaining path was a male descendant carrying his DNA. After weeks combing family records, investigators zeroed in on one man in Nashville, Mercer's grandson, a direct paternal match for comparison. The grandson knew nothing about the night. He lived an ordinary life, worked at a small auto shop. No criminal record, no connection to any investigation. That innocence made the approach trickier. One wrong move, and he could get suspicious, refuse to cooperate, or worse, sue the department. So the detectives opted for a covert DNA collection, a technique that had worked in other major cold cases. A two-person team was sent to Nashville posing as tourists. For days they shadowed the grandson and mapped his routine. Morning coffee at the same little shop near work. Sometimes a to-go soda at lunch, evening stop at the convenience store before heading home. Their goal was simple: recover something he discarded that carried usable DNA. On the fifth day the opportunity came. The grandson walked into his usual coffee shop and ordered an iced black coffee in a paper cup. The two detectives sat a few tables away, close enough to watch. When he finished most of it and got up to leave, the cup stayed on the table unnoticed, unclaimed. One of the detectives casually stood, pretended to take the newly empty seat, and when no one was looking, slipped the cup into a paper evidence bag. The whole thing took seconds, silent and natural. Nobody in the shop realized that moment had just turned a 50-year-old case. The cup was sealed immediately and driven back to the Alabama lab the same day. DNA was extracted from the rim and run against the sample from the 1950 fish steel nylon straps, a process that took only hours but felt endless to the waiting team. When the analyzer screen flashed the result, the room went dead quiet. Match 100. It meant the grandson's DNA was an exact match to the male DNA on the nylon straps found in Coraline and Jonas's van. And genealogy had already placed that DNA in the Mercer branch. And because Y DNA passes unchanged down the male line, a perfect match could only mean one thing. Hollis Mercer was the owner of the 1952 sample. No one else in the family could produce that exact match except him. At last, after more than 50 years of stalled investigations, mistakes, hope and heartbreak, the identity of the man who stood in the shadows of the Cullman parking lot, watched Coraline and Jonas, and made them vanish from the earth was known. The truth could no longer hide. The case had reached the point of no return. Though Mercer himself had been dead for decades, warrants could still be served on the places holding his personal effects, and that opened the door to the next phase. The grandson who had unknowingly given the covert sample stayed under loose surveillance, but the primary target for the search was Hollis Mercer's youngest daughter, now living in a quiet suburb outside Fayetteville. She had kept most of her father's papers, work tools and belongings after his death, making her house the most likely place to find critical historical evidence. A joint task force with local police approached the house at dawn, while mist still clung to the ground. Mercer's daughter answered the door, stunned, confused by the swarm of officers. When told the search warrant was for a 1952 case, she was too shocked to speak. The warrant was legal, and the team moved straight to the detached garage Mercer had used as a small repair shop in his later years. When the garage door rolled up, decades of dust rose in clouds. Inside were wooden crates, metal drawers and bins of old tools. The investigators worked methodically, knowing evidence could be hidden among the junk. The first drawer held ordinary mechanics tools, wrenches, hammers, pliers, exactly what you'd expect from a lifelong repairman. But deeper in they started finding items that raised eyebrows. First was an old pair of leather work gloves, dusty but still holding the shape of large, long, slender hands. The style and material dated to the late 1940s, exactly the era when Mercer drove. Those gloves could easily have been a spare pair or identical to the rubber ones found in the van in 1952. Red pen circled secondary roads in Alabama and Tennessee, routes that overlapped almost perfectly with the paths the modern GIS model said the killer probably took. Most chilling was a red X on the Cullman-Decatur corridor, the exact area where Coraline and Jonas were last seen. In the very back, inside a wooden box, was a small stack of papers, receipts, pay stubs, and repair invoices from One stub listed Mercer's work address in Huntsville for the exact week of the disappearance, proof he was in the area at the critical time. Every item was photographed, sealed, and logged. Nothing carried direct DNA or a confession, but together they painted a picture that fit the reconstructed timeline perfectly. Mercer was in the right place, at the right time, on the right roads, with the right kind of gear and travel habits. When news of the seized evidence spread, the Fayetteville area and neighboring towns reeled. To most people, Hollis Mercer had just been a quiet, harmless mechanic who kept to himself. But with DNA and the timeline pointing straight at him as the man who killed 2 young people in 1952, that peaceful image shattered overnight. Some old neighbors refused to believe it. Others remembered years when Mercer would disappear without explanation. A few admitted they always felt he was hiding something. Even though Mercer had been dead for decades, a symbolic arrest warrant was issued to make it official. Hollis Mercer was the suspect behind the disappearance of Coraline Whitlock and Jonas Kincaid. With genetic evidence, maps, historical items and supporting witness statements, the case finally had its answer, and the Alabama-Tennessee community now had to face the fact that the killer had lived among them for decades, without anyone ever knowing. When the investigators finished seizing evidence from the daughter's house, and officially announced the conclusion of the investigation, the Mercer family agreed to hand over the old notes and statements of Hollis Mercer that they still kept. Scattered handwritten pages in notebooks, cassette tapes he had recorded himself, and a few pages of testimony from a 1980 civil deposition when police had questioned him about an unrelated matter. This was a rare chance to hear what Mercer himself had ever said about the night of the night. In one old note found among the family documents, Mercer admitted he had met 2 young people in a van near Cullman, saying he had asked them for directions, and insisting that was his only contact. He wrote that he didn't remember their faces because it was dark. I only saw their silhouettes. At first glance, this seemed like an innocent statement, but to the investigators, it was the first sign of a serious contradiction. If Mercer had only run into them by chance, why did he feel the need to emphasize it, and why mention Cullman, the exact place where Coraline and Jonas were last seen? The coincidence was too big. Detectives suspected this was a self-protective statement, deliberately designed to place himself outside the circle of suspicion. In another old cassette recording, Mercer claimed he never went to Huntsville that month, yet payroll records police found in his garage confirmed he was at a factory north of Huntsville the very week of the disappearance. That statement instantly became the second major contradiction, destroying his entire attempt at self-exoneration. But the biggest hole in Mercer's story was the Kodak photograph. The last exposure on Coraline's roll of film clearly showed the silhouette of a man in a fedora standing next to the van. Tall, narrow shoulders, neck slightly tilted to the left. When compared to a 1948 family photo of Mercer, experts confirmed the body shapes were nearly identical. Though Mercer was no longer alive to be confronted, the image became the strongest visual evidence against his denials. In his personal notebook, Mercer had written that he never wore a fedora after, yet family photos his daughter turned over to investigators proved the opposite. He wore fedoras well into the 1960s, an undeniable fact. Mercer lied. When investigators compared Mercer's handwritten statements to the physical evidence inside the van, the contradictions spread even further. Mercer insisted that on his trips, he only ever brought leather or cloth gloves, never rubber gloves. Yet among the items recovered from his garage, the team found 2 old pairs of rubber gloves, identical in brand and style to the pair found in the van. His denial of ever using rubber gloves for work, while actually owning multiple pairs, was seen as a deliberate attempt to hide a tool used in the crime. And then came the biggest contradiction of all. In a 1989 family interview, Mercer had said he never in his life was involved in anything that hurt anyone. But DNA from the nylon straps, found in Coraline and Jonas's van, matched perfectly with his genetic line, confirmed through Y-DNA testing of his grandson. There was no possibility any other Mercer male left that DNA in the vehicle. Every other descendant in the same paternal branch was ruled out by timeline and 1952 address records. In other words, the DNA completely demolished Mercer's statement. In the final case file, the prosecutor described Mercer's old statements and notes with 3 phrases: a chain of self-contradictions, deliberate evasion, and incompatible with physical evidence. In particular, the prosecutor used the chain of contradictions as the lock that sealed the charge. Mercer said he stopped wearing fedoras. The Kodak photo proved he still did. Mercer said he never went to Huntsville. Payroll records proved he was there. Mercer said he only casually met the 2 young people. His DNA proved he handled the restraints used in the attack. Mercer said he never used rubber gloves. His garage contained multiple old pairs identical to the ones at the scene. In court, though Mercer was no longer alive to stand in the dock, his contradictory statements were presented as an airtight logical chain, as if he himself were proving his own lies. The prosecutors concluded, Hollis Mercer tried to leave behind a narrative that pushed him out of the story. But everything he said and everything he tried to hide, dragged him right back to the center of the crime. From here, the case moved into its final phase, finding the bodies and unearthing the full truth that had been buried for 7 decades. The chain of contradictions in Hollis Mercer's statements had made the picture of the crime almost complete, but one huge piece was still missing. No one knew where Coraline and Jonas had met their final end. For decades, the most common theory was that the perpetrator took them across the state line into Tennessee or dumped the bodies in remote forests where time and earth could erase all traces. But the truth was much closer, and it surfaced in a way no one expected. That summer, Alabama experienced its worst drought in years. The water level at Lake Guntersville, a massive man-made reservoir that stretches across several counties, dropped to a record low. Rocks, tree stumps and structures that had been submerged since the 1950s began to emerge. Locals flocked to the shoreline to take pictures and see what had been hidden under the water. In the middle of that curiosity, a fisherman spotted what looked like a human bone along the water's edge. At first he thought it was animal bone, but when he noticed other fragments scattered nearby along with a rusted metal chain, he immediately called the police. The cold case forensic team arrived the same day, and as soon as they surveyed the scene, they knew this was no ordinary find. The location was right next to one of the secondary roads the GIS model had flagged as a high-probability route for the perpetrator in 19. As the water receded further, investigators saw 2 skeletons just a few meters apart. One smaller, one larger, along with personal items half buried in the mud. Among them were a wooden comb, a hair clip fragment, and a metal lighter. All items the families of Coraline and Jonas had reported missing the night they vanished. The bone fragments were carefully collected and sent for analysis. After so many decades, no soft tissue remained, but modern techniques could still extract DNA from bone. The results left every investigator speechless. One skeleton belonged to Coraline Whitlock. The other belonged to Jonas Kincaid. After more than half a century they had finally been found. Though the exact cause of death could not be determined, the bones were too eroded for clear trauma marks. The discovery location suggested Mercer may have brought them to the shallow part of the lake and left them in the darkness. The 2 skeletons lay close together, as if they had remained side by side in their final moments. Finding the remains not only confirmed the victims died in 1952, but corroborated the entire final timeline built from GIS modeling, genealogy, and Mercer's contradictory statement. The steep terrain, dry forest, and high water levels for decades had hidden every trace, turning the lake into a perfect natural grave. No one ever thought they were there, until the drought revealed the truth time had tried to bury. With the remains confirmed and the location matching the case reconstructions perfectly, The cold case team knew they had crossed the final threshold to close a 70-year-old file. The truth had risen from the bottom of the lake, cold, brutal, but also the answer generations had waited for. Coraline and Jonas had finally been found, and their story was about to enter its final chapter. The trial verdict and the shockwave that would ripple through the community. The discovery of Coraline and Jonas's remains at Lake Guntersville provided the final legal push to move the case to federal court. Because Mercer, though long dead, was accused of kidnapping 2 Alabama citizens and transporting them across state lines, the case fell under federal jurisdiction per the Mann Act, and even though he was no longer alive to face the jury, the trial was held to establish criminal responsibility, issue an official verdict, and close the oldest open case in the state. On opening day, the courtroom was packed. A few surviving relatives of Coraline and Jonas, now in their late 70s, were wheeled to the front row. Hollis Mercer's daughter was also present, silent and visibly torn. The prosecution explained that the purpose of the trial was not to punish a dead man, but to have the law officially acknowledge the truth, restore the victims' voices, and give the community the answer it had waited nearly 7 decades for. The first evidence presented was DNA, the strongest link in the chain. Male DNA from the nylon straps matched 100% with the Y DNA of Mercer's direct male descendants. A match genealogy confirmed, could not be mistaken. No other male branch of the family fit the timeline or was even present in Alabama in 1952. The prosecutor declared, DNA didn't create a suspect, it identified the perpetrator. Next came the Kodak photo, the image of the fedora-wearing figure standing right next to the Ford van in the Cullman parking lot. Family photos of Mercer from the 1940s were shown side by side. Body proportion experts concluded the 2 silhouettes had an abnormally high degree of similarity. Height, shoulder ratio, the curve of the spine when standing all matched young Mercer. Then the prosecution introduced the timeline reconstructed with modern science, proving the perpetrators rode from Cullman to Decatur, then north to Huntsville before taking the victims toward Lake Guntersville, or Tennessee. All 3 key points on the timeline matched places Mercer either worked or regularly drove through in the summer of 1952. One by one, Decatur, Huntsville, Guntersville, all fell within Mercer's normal work radius. No other suspect fit the pattern so precisely. Next came the physical evidence, personal items belonging to Coraline and Jonas recovered at Lake Guntersville. Each piece added another layer of weight to the shadow of Mercer, the man who had lived in silence for decades carrying a truth only he knew. Finally, the prosecution presented the most damning part, Mercer's own chain of contradictory statements collected by detectives from notes and family accounts. He said he stopped wearing fedoras, photos proved he did. He said he never went to Huntsville, payroll records proved the opposite. He said he only briefly spoke to the 2 young people, his DNA was on the restraints inside the van. Every word Mercer ever spoke, when measured against reality, rang hollow, like desperate attempts to push himself out of the story. Mercer's family attorney could only argue that the age of the evidence might have introduced errors, but forensic experts affirmed the integrity of the process. There was no gap large enough to create reasonable doubt. After 3 days of trial, the jury delivered its final verdict. Hollis Mercer guilty of interstate kidnapping resulting in death, a federal charge carrying a life sentence. The judge declared the sentence symbolic since Mercer was deceased, but its meaning went far beyond punishment. We return names to the victims and truth to justice. The Coraline Whitlock and Jonas Kincaid case file, open for 67 years, was officially closed. Sobs broke out in the front row, and for the first time in decades, the silence surrounding the case was no longer darkness, it was peace, because justice had finally called the perpetrator by name. The story of the Alabama 1952 cold case solved, arrest shocks community, is not just a nearly 7-decade investigation, it also reflects very real issues in American life today. Personal safety, the limits of trust in strangers, the importance of forensic science, and the value of persistence in the pursuit of justice. Americans today still live in an open, highly mobile society, where we encounter strangers constantly. This makes the lesson of situational awareness, and recognizing one's surroundings incredibly relevant, whether parking a car, walking at night, or noticing someone who seems to be following you. Another lesson is the value of modern forensic technology and science. In the story, the case languished for decades because the tools didn't exist. Yet from one old piece of nylon, forensic DNA unlocked the entire truth. In today's America, where high-tech crime, genetics and data analysis are increasingly common, the story reminds us that investing in forensic science is a direct investment in justice. Old cases are not hopeless. They just need time and technology to mature. The story also reflects a painful but important point. Early mistakes can shape half a century of searching for justice. Failing to seal roads or collect fingerprints properly sent the original investigation down the wrong path. For Americans today, from police officers to administrators to ordinary citizens, the lesson is that professional standards and responsibility from minute one can save a life or spare an entire family decades of pain. And finally, solving a case after 67 years reminds us that justice, no matter how slow, can still arrive if society keeps looking for it, with transparency, science and respect for those who no longer have a voice to defend themselves. Thank you for following to the end of this 67-year case journey. If this story touched you, please subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next cold case. See you in the next video, where we'll continue exploring mysteries America thought were lost forever.